Hi, I'm Ozzie Ostwalt. This week on Religion and Life, we take a look at the holiday traditions that surround us at this time of year. We take many of these traditions for granted, not thinking about the significance behind them. My guests today, Mary Volante and Craig Caldwell, will help us understand some of the interesting history behind some of our most familiar holiday traditions. Welcome to you both, and thank you for coming.
Thanks for having us.
All right, so this time of year we are really inundated with Christmas decorations, holiday traditions and celebrations, symbols and so forth. And oftentimes we don't think about what lies behind some of these traditions and symbols and celebrations. So I'd like for you to help me with that today. And one of the things that we often see this time of year is a menorah, and I think we have an image of this. So I thought we'd start there. It might not be quite as familiar as some of the images we see around, but this menorah, can you tell us a little bit about it, Craig and Mary?
Right. So the menorah tradition, the historical story behind the menorah tradition comes from the 2nd century BC and the Jewish revolt against one of Alexander the Great's successors, and the purification of the temple following the restoration of the Jewish monarchy. What's interesting is that the menorah, as a sacred object in the temple, doesn't have any date assigned to it particularly, and it's the medieval tradition that I think gives us the familiar ritual of the Jewish menorah.
And that ritual being then attached to the celebration of Hanukkah, which takes place about this time of year. Is that correct?
Yeah, so there were medieval Jewish scholars who wrote about the ritual itself and how to celebrate and discussed the best way to do it. So in some of the traditions, it'd be the opposite of how people do it now. So they would light the entire menorah on the first night of Hanukkah, and the second night one less candle, and the third night one less candle, until they get down to the final day would only be one. Other places they would do it like we do it now, where you'd on the first night light the first candle and go up to celebrate the 9 days that the oil lasted during the revolt.
Yeah, so the festival or the Feast of Lights, as Hanukkah is called, represents and recalls the rededication of the temple. The miracle was supposed to be that a small amount of oil actually was enough oil to light the lamps for 8 days. So you have this beautiful 8-pronged or 9-pronged candlestick that we call the menorah. So Hanukkah really is not what I often hear Jewish Christmas at all. In fact, the event that inspires Hanukkah predates Christmas and Christianity as we know it.
And it was still celebrated. I mean, today the most popular, people talk about eating latkes, potato pancakes, but of course there were no potatoes in the Middle Ages. So, but because of the tradition of oil, anything fried was still part of the celebration. So families would fry dough and drizzle it with honey as a special treat during the Hanukkah days.
So in addition to Hanukkah and the celebration of Hanukkah in the Jewish tradition, we often hear about Kwanzaa, but this is a tradition that's not necessarily ancient, nor is it religious in its origin. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's modern 1960s, 20th century. It's very American celebration, African-American celebration. And my understanding is it's a celebration of African-Americanness, pan-religion.
They did get the idea of assigning values or to individual candles, which I think comes from, I don't know, the medieval Jewish tradition assigns value to the candles, but certainly the numbering of the candles and those kinds of things seems to be a parallel of the Hanukkah celebration.
Okay. All right, so with all of this going on, I guess, at least in this part of the world, southern United States, the most obvious images we see, the most obvious celebrations that are going on, the most obvious traditions that are being carried forth are attached to the celebration of Christmas. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Christmas and why do we celebrate it at this time of year, Greg?
So there are at least 2 or 3 different Roman holidays this time of year, but the biggest and most famous is the Saturnalia in honor of Saturn, who is Jupiter's father. So if you know Greek mythology, that's Zeus's dad, who seems to be associated with the harvest, right? The scythe god and all that kind of thing. So the the solstice should be the end of all of the harvest season, and therefore some kind of celebration of that. But the way the Romans celebrated that's really quite so interesting and fascinated people, Christians who condemned it, was by inverting all the social norms. So you'd have slaves who were permitted to dine at the table with their masters, or masters would wait on their slaves. People would give presents, wear little hats that indicated their freedom as freed slaves, and generally make merry for as much as a week, even though, and this is an interesting parallel with modern Christmas tradition, there's only one actual feast day, but Romans were infamous for stretching that out over 3, 5, or even 7 days.
You're talking about the winter solstice, which occurs on December the 21st or the 22nd,
Right.
I suppose.
December 25th is probably the birthday of the sun from the Sol Invictus tradition. So that's a way in which the Saturnalia tradition gets merged with a kind of Mithraic or a Sol Invictus
I
tradition.
think we have an image of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. And since the winter solstice is the longest night of the year, here we go, a beautiful image here, Sol Invictus. The winter solstice is the longest night of the year, and it commemorates the rebirth of the sun, right? So the sun begins its long march up the sky, again following the solstice.
And we know that by about 300 AD, then we've got, not Christians, but all Romans who seem to be interested in celebrating the birthday of the sun on December 25th with chariot races, so a big NASCAR race kind of thing. In Rome on December 25th, which was a public holiday, it's the birthday of the sun. So that gives us our first kind of December 25th date as an event on the calendar that maybe Christianity becomes more associated with when they start thinking about Christ's birthday.
How did the celebration of Christmas, the birth of Jesus, become associated with Sol Invictus, the birthday of the sun? When and how did that occur? Because my understanding is that, we don't know when Jesus would have been born, what time of the year, but scholars seem to put it in the springtime. So how did it get associated with this winter solstice celebration?
Well, since we have Sol up there, lots of ancient Mediterranean and ancient Near Eastern people worship the sun, but Sol Invictus is a particularly imperial idea of the unconquered sun. So this is the sun as sort of sovereign. So you can see some ways in which Christ Victor, this victorious Christ, he's very common in late antiquity, Christ the militant, Christ the conqueror, might have been associated with, by some Christians, with this particular solar aspect. The other thing is Constantine, the first Christian emperor, and his father were devotees of the solar cult. So it may be that they already are thinking about, Christ manifests some aspects of this sovereign sun. But as far as we know, the Christians don't really pick up on that date until the very late 4th or early 5th century, when it seems that date is sort of something that they associate with.
And Constantine, he is the first emperor to make Christianity legal, I believe. And was he a follower of the Mithraic cult? Does that have anything? And we have an image here of from the Mithraic cult. You might want to comment on that. Here we go.
What we know about Mithras, now lots of different flavors of solar worship, but Mithras was an aspect of sort of an Eastern mystery cult that's popular in the Roman army. So it's very possible that Constantine and his father were exposed to it. Mithras here sacrificing the bull, and lots of people have seen some Christian parallels with a salvific sacrifice. Initiates into the Mithraic cult bathed in blood of the bull, and that may have some I wouldn't say appeal to Christians, but I think as Christianity explains itself, perhaps some Mithraic initiates might have been attracted to it. We don't know a whole lot about Mithras' calendar. That's the one interesting thing. The Sol Invictus, we can date to that December 25th. Mithras is so secretive and later probably suppressed by Christianity. It's hard to know exactly what they were doing or when they were doing it.
It was very interesting. And what I take from this here is that we have this kind of combination of pagan traditions and Christian traditions coming together in the ancient world to help define the way we celebrate the season still today.
And an outright co-opting.
And outright co-opting, right.
Dates and traditions.
So is this a pattern, this kind of, you might call it Christianization of pagan traditions?
It was a very conscious decision in many cases. So as Christianity began to spread throughout the empire and even beyond it, one of the things that early missionaries would deliberately do would be to co-opt sacred spaces, turn the temples, the local places of worship into churches, the local pagan deities, instead of getting rid of them, co-opt them as minor saints if they needed to. In Ireland, the tradition of holy wells is a very pagan tradition, but they all became Christianized over time by being blessed by saints. So this co-opting of sacred places and sacred traditions is very common.
So what we have here is a co-opting of the winter solstice traditions and pulling them into the Christian sphere, and then using that as a way of celebrating the birth of Jesus. And my understanding is that really Christmas as a celebration of the birth of Jesus was very uncommon until the 4th and 5th centuries. Is that correct? Is it?
Well, I mean, Christians couldn't celebrate many things openly before Constantine anyway, and a lot of the most important of the early fathers, like Origen, did not like this idea of gift giving and greedy little children and this idea of big celebrations. That's what pagans did.
Sure. I mean,
Good
Easter,
Christians don't need that.
Easter is the fixation, right? Dating Easter, making Easter correspond to the Jewish calendar. Those are the things the early church fathers are really interested in. I think Christianity is probably more of a popular thing than anything. I mean, we already have all these other feasts in December. It'd be a natural thing for Christians to want to be able to celebrate those things without getting bound up in solar worship or Saturn worship or anything else.
Now, I have another image here of a nativity scene, since we've kind of made the transition here to looking at Christmas, and Christmas is celebrating the birth of Jesus. Here's a beautiful nativity scene that we probably would all recognize, and it's very elaborate. You have characters from both the story in the Gospel of Luke, the shepherds, for example, and from the Gospel of Matthew, the Magi or the wise men, all brought together here in kind of one story. Now, we were talking a little bit about nativity scenes earlier. Mary, could you comment on where these come from and how they got started?
The earliest one we know about was St. Francis of Assisi. And Francis celebrated, or he created nativity out in the caves. He always associated being away from cities and away from civilization as getting closer to God. And he's often depicted in his iconography as with animals. And he created a nativity that was very simple. It was apparently a baby Jesus and a couple of animals, and that was it. Some of the beasts from the stable. And that was his, and that began to be imitated, and the idea picked up from there.
And now we have these very elaborate nativity scenes, sometimes live nativity scenes and plays in churches as a way of recreating. Now, they're not always biblically accurate, right? Because they have these two narratives that they bring together and kind of, without any kind of critical assessment, just put them together without acknowledging that the stories come from different places. But it's still a beautiful part of the celebration. All right, so one of the things that we see everywhere right now associated with Christmas is greenery. Perhaps the Christmas tree. I think we have an image of a nice tree here. Not that we need it, everybody recognizes them, but the Christmas tree is probably one of the most significant symbols associated with greenery that we have attached to the Christmas tradition. And there's some interesting history around various types of greenery. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, the idea of when we talk about the solar cults and the idea of sort of resurrection or eternity gets picked up in that. But I think it's Northern Europe that really gives us more of the idea of the evergreen than anything else. Maybe in the Middle Ages.
Yeah. So mistletoe. Where the first record we have is Pliny the Elder in the 1st century, where he describes Druids in Gaul collecting mistletoe that was growing on trees with a special sickle and catching it in their white cloaks, although it's not associated with any particular time of the year. It was a particular time of the month. They had to follow the moon cycle to get the right date. We know that mistletoe was at least seen as, because of course it's always green, even in the middle of winter, and often still has berries. It was associated with fertility, although in Norse mythology it was mistletoe that killed Balder, the son of Odin, with Loki's trick. So it was used to kill Balder. So, but mostly it was associated with fertility because it never seemed to die like everything else did.
Right. So now this ancient association with fertility, I mean, our holdover from that is that we kiss under the mistletoe, right? So there still that kind of romantic connection with mistletoe. But I think evergreens in general, right, have come to kind of associate fertility, eternal life, because they don't seem to die, right? They're green throughout the winter. So I think people begin to use evergreens, greenery to decorate their homes around the Christmas time.
Yeah, I mean, trees and boughs of evergreens, both, to the point where in some places in Northern Europe, the landlords were trying to ban people from going and cutting down all the trees because then they didn't have the wood come spring when they wanted it, because everyone's cutting down the trees. But we also have records of a Baker's Guild, for example, donating a decorated tree, decorated with apples and little baked goods, since they were a Baker's Guild, to a children's hospital locally. People decorating with paper flowers, but apples were very common. Hang, because that's something, winter apples you'd have through the winter.
And we have Romans giving each other baked goods. That's one of the other interesting traditions. A feast of Dionysus around Christmas celebrated in the Eastern Empire, so in Constantinople, in which the Romans would give each other these little baked goods in honor of Dionysus around December 25th. So we've had Christmas cookies for longer than maybe we've had.
Yeah, we have. Well, baked goods still a kind of a traditional gift to give at the season, right? So Dionysus is kind of hard to get rid of, right? He kind of hangs around all these holidays, doesn't he? I think we were talking earlier, I believe I read somewhere that Martin Luther was one of the first to, as you mentioned, kind of co-opt this tradition of greenery into the Christmas tradition, and he encouraged bringing the trees into the public square and decorating them with Christian symbols. So today we still have the Chrismon tree with a green evergreen decorated with symbols, Christian symbols, chrismons. Well, let's see this next image. Of course, we all recognize this jolly fellow, Santa Claus. But Santa Claus didn't always look like this, and perhaps didn't carry the same function as he does today. I think this guy, the way he looks now, maybe dates to the late 19th century. Or so, early 19th century, I'm not sure.
I think it's early 20th. It's Coca-Cola.
Even later. So the Coca-Cola franchise, the image of Santa Claus is responsible. So what's behind the Santa Claus legend? I mean, obviously, Santa Claus wasn't at the Nativity, right? So how did Santa Claus get connected with this Christian tradition celebrating the birth of Jesus?
We've got a non-martyr saint from the 4th century A.D. From a city in what is now Turkey, whose feast day is in early December. What's interesting is with the rise of celebrating saints' days, we might have also gotten a certain legitimation of Christmas itself. So while I don't think any ancient person would have confused Nicholas with Jesus Christ or assimilated their days at all, the celebration of both days is probably part of a common tradition. Christians celebrating their own birthdays, saints' days, and then the birthday of Jesus Christ.
So the saint you're talking about now from the 4th century, Saint Nicholas.
Right.
Okay, all right.
But he was, I mean...
He's a bishop.
Gave gifts to children, but he's not really a big deal in the Middle Ages. The gifts would be from the Magi. So it was a celebration of the Epiphany, the 12th day of Christmas, on January 6th. That was the gift-giving day, and that was the day that the Magi brought gifts. Santa Claus, Father Christmas, not really mentioned in medieval texts.
So there's a couple of things going on here. It gets a little bit confusing. So we've got this 4th century bishop, St. Nicholas, who I believe is the patron saint of children and has traditionally been known to give gifts to children. And then you have the more ancient notion or tradition or legend that the Magi brought gifts to Jesus, and that became associated then with the celebration of the birth of Jesus. So I guess you have these two traditions pulled together at some point, but not, as you said, until later in the Middle Ages. Is that correct?
Or later than the Middle Ages.
Later than the Middle Ages. Okay. So. And then certainly didn't morph directly into the Santa Claus as we know it. I've got this next image here is actually an image of St. Nicholas, the bishop. And this might take a little explaining. Let's leave this image up here just for a moment and talk about this a little bit. Obviously, we recognize what we can easily identify as St. Nicholas holding the staff, which, by the way, is in the shape of a candy cane. I think
or a bishop's crook.
Yeah, the little bishop's crook. But who? And we have the children before St. Nicholas. But who's this character with St. Nicholas here? Where did he come from?
Well, I mean, he was sort of discovered in Germany, but interestingly, it was the late 19th, early 20th century when some folklorists came across some German celebrations, Christmas parades, basically, where St. Nicholas was attended by, among other things, this figure of Krampus, but he had a whole court that was one.
Krampus, you say?
Yeah,
Yes,
and
okay.
his job was apparently to punish the naughty children, but it's very dramatic. The early folklorists who saw it assumed it was a medieval tradition because it was well established, but we don't know how old it is.
So early on you have St. Nicholas and this character Krampus, and we'll look at this next image too, who can be really quite frightening.
That explains the bad horror movies.
Bad horror movie, would travel together, and the naughty children would get something from Krampus or be punished by Krampus, and good children would receive a treat from St. Nicholas. That part of the legend, I guess, has been evolving somewhat now, so we don't see Krampus too much anymore, although, Craig, I think you said earlier there's a movie out.
Yeah, there's that. I mean, the interesting thing is that Nicholas originally is a charity figure, right? I mean, he's taking care of children, part of Christianity's general sort of love of widows and orphans and things like that. By the time the German tradition seems to say, well, someone has to punish the bad ones. It's not enough to reward the good ones or the orphans. We need to actually have a separate, distinct figure to make sure that the bad children get punished.
What were those punishments like? Any indication? Did we?
Well, I mean, the one I know from modern references is putting bad children in a sack.
Yes, kidnapping them.
Kidnapping. That must have been horrifying for children.
Well, I think it's part of the parade. It was part of a joke in the parade that
Okay.
whoever was dressed as Krampus would grab kids and drag them a few feet and let them run back.
So now the worst thing that happens to bad children is they are not on the list and they don't get presents, right? So,
Hole in the stocking.
sorry, a hole in the stocking. They're pretty good. Well, I'm glad that part of the tradition has evolved somewhat then. Now, we were also talking earlier about some traditions that may not be as familiar that are associated with Christmas, the 12 days of Christmas, the Feast of Epiphany. We hear about these things, but maybe don't understand them. Could you say a little bit about how the Christmas season is measured, from when to when, and what goes on there?
So, Mary, you want to talk about the 12 days?
Originally, Advent is not the 12 days of Christmas. The entire Christmas season began with Advent and then ended with the Feast of the Epiphany, which is January 6th. Advent was a kind of second Lent. It was a time of fasting, of preparation, a very serious season. Therefore, Christmas was the big feast day. That's when everybody would eat, party. If you've ever read Gawain and the Green Knight, the feast they're holding there is Christmas. And then from there, that's day one of the 12 days. So there's Christmas, the big festival, Stephen's Day on the 26th. It's good King Wenceslas, King Stephen, who gave away, again, to children. So you would give away your leftovers to the poor on the 26th. The Feast of John the Baptist, and then eventually, and then the Massacre of the Innocents, which is commemorated in the Coventry Carol even today, one of the few very old carols we still sing. So Christmas carols were much more mournful. And then eventually, when the Adoration of the Magi, so you'd get the Feast of the Epiphany, when the Magi brought gifts.
So you're really talking about a fairly extensive season here, for Advent being 5 weeks?
Something like that.
4 Sundays.
Four Sundays leading up to Christmas, and that's a period of fasting and anticipation and waiting. Then the Christmas feast, and then marking off the 12 days of Christmas, going to January the 6th, which is the gift giving.
Well, the gifts could be given to different traditions in different regions, but yeah, they would sometimes, especially if you were wealthy, you could give gifts away starting on Christmas, and then the Epiphany was the last day of it.
Don't let my daughter hear that there's 12 days of gift giving. All right, so I
she knows the song.
One day's enough. So January the 6th is Epiphany then, and that marks the end of the whole season. That's fascinating, I think, to see how that has been kind of condensed into one main day of celebration now. Now, we were again talking earlier that there's, up until, say, the mid-20th century, there was an interesting way of celebrating Christmas in Appalachia, in this region, and particularly in the more isolated areas of Appalachia. But in some of those areas, they celebrated what was called Old Christmas, and it was on January the 6th. So I'm assuming that Old Christmas was attached to the Feast of the Epiphany, and that was a holdover from some of these European traditions.
Well, and I think it was called Little Christmas in Ireland and the UK.
So it would have
needed-
come from the celebration of Little Christmas, given that this area was settled largely by Presbyterian Scots, Irish. Well, that's very interesting. So as we enter the season, what are some of the comments, given what we've talked about with Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, briefly, Christmas? How do you make sense of all that's going on? Because obviously our celebrations have changed quite drastically through the centuries. So how do you make sense of this? And
The Roman tradition had in it both a public holiday. There was actually the courts closed and people were encouraged not to do public things on Saturnalia. So you have one day of public holiday surrounded by general festivities. And I think that's something that modern Christmas celebrations still have in common, that there's a relatively small nucleus of this event, be it Christian or not, and then around it people have erected all kinds of other things not to do work on particular days perhaps.
Right.
And the other thing is the layers of sort of soteriology or various ideas of salvation or whose birthday it is exactly, whether it's the sun, whether it's Christ, whether it's a feast dedicated to Saturn. There's lots of interpretation here and lots of interpretations that might be able to coexist even after the Roman Empire became Christian. The fact that people might still be celebrating a Dionysiac festival suggests that there are a lot of things in late December.
so we don't know really what we're doing. Is that what we have?
Traditions evolve. I mean, Elf on the
Exactly.
Shelf is such a new one that's certainly not something I grew up with, and my kids are now nagging me to get. I'm not going to get them one, but they want to do Elf on the Shelf because they've heard of it from their friends.
Elf on
So
the
there's
Shelf.
so there's always new ideas and new traditions.
So we have this evolution of traditions, layering of pagan culture with a more Christianized co-opting of these traditions, cultural traditions combining and recombining to give us what we have today, which is a combination of religious history, traditions, and secular culture. And it's just all very fascinating. I appreciate you all helping us kind of put this together today. Well, that's it for Religion and Life for this week. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please contact us at watchapptv.com. Until next time, have a happy holiday. I'm Ozzie Ostwalt.